Welcome to the Recovery Roundtable podcast, where the journey to sobriety opens up through powerful discussions and shared experiences. Join your host, Mark, who will bring you stories of triumph and resilience from the heart of Pacific Shores recovery. Every episode offers insights and support, guiding you through the challenges of addiction recovery. Thank you for joining our community. If you're ready to start or continue your recovery journey, we're here to inspire and support you. Let's explore recovery together.
All right.
Sure.
Well, welcome. I'm so excited that you're here because I love learning from experts in their field. And you were so kind. I'm asking you right before we just hit record, how do we know each other again? And you started sharing some wonderful stuff. So I thought, let's just hit record so you can share that. So why don't you introduce who you are and how we got connected?
Sure. No, I appreciate it, Mark. My name is Dr. Henry Zarenba. I work at Apex Brain Centers in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm a board certified chiropractic neurologist, meaning I went through chiropractic school and then from there went on to get further education to, pass the board exams and all of that. The center that I work at is a brain rehabilitation center. So we work primarily with people who've had concussions or other types of brain injuries, but we also work with people who suffer from addiction or substance abuse disorder, because neurology and the way the brain works is a huge part of being able to improve and kind of live with, substance abuse disorder.
And this is awesome. And I want to focus primarily on that aspect because that's one of the biggest questions is nature versus nurture and different things with addiction. So as you were getting educated and you've been working with all these clients, what have you seen in regards to the brain, specifically with addiction?
Well, one of the things that I've seen that I feel like, oh my God, this needs to be talked about more is I haven't had a single patient come through our office that we don't talk about, who's suffering from addiction, who hasn't had some sort of head injury or concussion. Whether it was from a slip and fall, whether it was from a car accident, which is unfortunately common, or even, an assault, getting themselves in a situation that maybe they shouldn't have been in. But that's one of the first things that we notice because the brain has a lot of things that it has to do, right? It has to keep our heart beating. It has to keep us up on 2 feet. There's a lot of things going on there. So being able to control our behavior and control our impulses, these kinds of high level cognitive demands and behavioral demands are really difficult for a brain just in any sort of existence. So then if you take a head injury and put it on top of that, it's going to make it even more difficult to have proper impulse control, attention skills, which are very much related. So then we're more likely to reach for something that's going to regulate our nervous system from the outside. And that's going to form a habit of addiction and a behavior pattern that can then kind of snowball into substance abuse disorder and addiction.
So you said a few buzzwords that I love: impulse control and then the habit of addiction. Can we kind of go down those two rabbit holes?
Oh, sure, sure, of course. Um, you know, one of the things that we talk to patients about all the time is the idea of attention. And it's kind of a buzzword nowadays, too, in all kinds of ways, especially as technology and social media continue to become more pervasive and sort of reach its fingers into different aspects of our life. People talk a lot about ADHD and these types of attention deficit and learning disabilities, which I think is part of what we're talking about here. But at the same time, your ability to pay attention to something is very much your ability to regulate your brain's output, because the output of attention is you're holding your eyes on something, you're holding your thoughts and your focus on something. The same part of the brain that helps us to be able to focus on something is the same part of the brain that's going to regulate our emotions and our impulses. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And we spend a lot of time talking to patients about it because it does a lot of things and it's very complicated. But the thing is, it's not your fate, the way that it's functioning. It can be changed and it can be altered.
So knowing that it can be changed and altered, let's kind of start with the beginning is what is some of the typical trauma that you see that actually affects that prefrontal cortex that enables that impulse control?
So I think one of the bigger thing is too is that people that have impulse control issues outwardly aren't necessarily broken or it's everybody has issues with impulse control. The prefrontal cortex is developing from the time we're born through when we're 25 years old for most people. So it's one of those things where so much has to go right for our brain to have high levels of impulse control and self-regulation that it doesn't take much for that cascade to go wrong. So, I mean, things from obviously I deal with a lot of patients with severe traumatic brain injuries and car accidents and those kinds of head traumas, but even simple whiplash injuries can lead to basically the brain's kind of floating in the skull. So a whiplash injury can kind of push the brain around in there and lead to some deficits in the prefrontal, not to mention the chemical injury that comes along with environmental toxins, things that we breathe and is in the water that we drink and the food that we eat. Some people seem to be able to detoxify that stuff. Some people hold on to it and affects their brain chemistry. And whether it stops the brain from developing that impulse control initially, or that impulse control is affected in a negative way after it's sort of matured and developed. That's sort of when we talk about what separates us from the animals and kind of higher levels of thinking and humanism, it's all that prefrontal cortex and impulse control ultimately.
Okay. And then
I know I kind of rambled a little bit
no,
there.
no,
Sorry for
that's
that.
I'm geeking out over here because
Yeah,
I am not a doctor.
sure, sure.
But I love looking into this stuff and then seeing how to apply it real world. Because we're an inpatient outpatient treatment center that just hit 25 years. So I've seen a lot of people come through the doors and seen certain patterns in different things. So one of the things that I picked up on that you shared is the habit of addiction. You mind kind of elaborating on that and going a little bit deeper?
Sure. The brain is ultimately all about information in and information out, right? And there's kind of processing that happens in the middle there. But when we talk about habits and fixed behaviors, we see all the time with our patients that good habits and good decisions tend to stack on each other, whereas negative decisions or more detrimental decisions are going to kind of roll in either direction. And that's because there's different parts of the brain that kind of lead to those decisions. So the part of the brain we were talking about, the prefrontal cortex that helps to inhibit our impulses, essentially works in opposition with our limbic system. The limbic system is part of the temporal lobe, which is kind of literally lower down in our brain. And that's where I always jokingly tell people it's kind of like the moody teenager slash caveman that's in all of us that just wants to sit on the couch and eat a million donuts and just not do anything. And that's the part of your brain that's going to crave drugs because ultimately it's craving comfort. It's sort of craving a sense of feeling okay, and ultimately that regulation, right? That self-regulation word that we're coming up with, and you can get that sense of feeling okay in the temporal lobe, which is more of the comfort-seeking behaviors, right? So we talk about habits that are going to kind of give you that buzz, but don't lead to long-term feelings of fulfillment or lead to long-term positive effects in your environment. Or there's the executive control, higher levels of cognition and prefrontal cortex way of living. So you literally are living in your prefrontal cortex or you're living in your temporal lobe. And the people who oftentimes are kind of stuck in addiction, they don't have access to their prefrontal cortex. And it's because of all the reasons that we talked about. It's because of mechanical injuries to the brain, chemical injuries to the brain, even the way that technology bombards us in the environment, I think makes it more difficult for the brain to be able to inhibit impulses because information in, information out, if there's just too much information coming in, it's going to affect that whole feedback loop. So that's a big part of it is that when we make a decision that kind of leads our behavior in a certain direction, either good or bad, we're kind of taking the first step of a long journey. And it's teaching our brain how to act, right? So when we make good decisions, they tend to stack because we're teaching our brain that that's important, and those negative decisions, we're teaching our brain that it's okay to just kind of be lazy and do the things that aren't going to lead to that long-term fulfillment because you can still feel okay, with the magic of drugs or whatever thing is kind of that comfort, comfort foods, being addicted to things like porn or video games, things like that too. It's not like drugs are the only thing that we're talking about with these neural networks.
So you have a client, let's say, who
Mhm.
hears what you're saying and says, "Gosh, this sounds really good." What would be like the next step of actual tangible steps they can take to start to do the work needed to begin to regulate that impulse control?
Sure. So, there are a lot of practitioners out there that deal with concussions and head injuries. Unfortunately, with most MD neurologists or traditional, kind of medical avenues out there, they're mostly going to rule out any sort of life-threatening situation with a head injury. And then in terms of rehab, there are some people doing good things out there, but I don't think it's as standard as it should be. So I would recommend people just really do their research, and if you've had a head injury in the past, car accidents and slip and falls are the most common one. But been in altercations, things like that. I would definitely recommend finding a specialist in your area who deals with concussions. Seeing if you can get in there and get that addressed. And uh, Outside of that, there are a lot of other things you can do to kind of hack your own brain and try to activate your prefrontal cortex. Even low tech things like exercise are some of the best things that you can do. But we work with patients remotely as well, so we do distance consultations, but then we also have patients that'll travel and do outpatient treatment at our center for a week or two, like brain boot camp kind of thing. We've worked with people from all over with substance abuse issues, and as part of as part of a team, we're not like the one-stop shop, but by addressing the clinical neuroscience and the neurology behind it, what we found is that it makes the work that people like you are doing more effective. It's kind of like we're working on different sides of the same thing here.
This episode is brought to you by Pacific Shores Recovery. We have been an industry leader for over 25 years in the mental health and addiction field. What we do works. We have helped thousands and thousands of individuals and families overcome their addiction and their issues. If you or a loved one need support or some kind of help, please reach out at the number below. We are here to help. So with a lot of people, because I'm just trying to think of the clients we work with,
Yeah.
not that many are able to identify a head trauma necessarily, but I know just as you've been talking, I'm going through my life and I'm like, oh, in sports, I remember bonking my head, but never thinking that big of a deal. I've fallen a ton throughout my life, gotten close to concussions. Um, but if someone's not able to identify of, well, I've had head trauma, knowing how active we are this day and age and how much trauma may be happening to the brain, what are some signs that a person can look for that may want to go this avenue of, yeah, this could be part of it?
Sure. And that's a really good question because I think a lot of times with brain injuries, and well, it's just now it's March, so March is Brain Injury Awareness Month, and that's one of the themes of the whole month is basically that brain injuries are something that's invisible, right? You can see if someone has a scar from a cut or a broken arm or something like that. So um, from that perspective, people oftentimes think of headaches as the most common thing, like, oh, I get headaches or I don't get headaches. And that's a common thing. But one of the most common things is we see people with eye movement issues. And the way that you're seeing things is one part of vision, but also the way that your eyes are tracking targets and focusing on things has a huge element in our behavior and huge effects on that. And that's a common thing that can be affected by these head injuries. So if you're the type of person that you feel like you're sensitive to bright lights, maybe you have difficulty with reading or you get eye strain or issues like that, that's a common one. GI complaints are common after head injuries too. That's something that people don't think about is when you hit your head, you actually get changes to the cells in your intestinal lining. And there's this inflammatory cascade that happens there too. And a lot of times the first symptom of a concussion is actually diarrhea. So, the symptoms are just so entirely far reaching that it's difficult to pinpoint any one thing. So I usually just recommend most people should have some sort of brain evaluation done. It's just unfortunately not as standard in the system as I think it should be. But, prioritizing all the things that we're taught generally that are good for our health are usually good for our brain, like eating right, exercising, sleep, especially exercise is one that we find to be particularly effective. There's a great book for people that are, the readers out there called Spark, and that's by a doctor named John Ratey, Ratey. But the book talks all about how we think of exercise as like working the muscles and kind of working our body, but you're literally healing and growing your brain when you exercise. You get all these what are called neurotrophic factors, or these different chemicals that kind of tell your neurons and your cells in your brain to grow and connect and to function at a higher level. You really enhance the signaling of those neurotrophic factors with things like high intensity interval exercise or endurance exercise. So that's one of those things that people think like, oh yeah, I should exercise. That's good for me. I know that's a good thing to do. But you're literally healing and rewiring your brain when you exercise, especially intensely.
So you've found a direct correlation with exercise, especially high intensity, and actually seeing a positive outcome with impulse control and repairing of the brain.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And it has to do with a lot of these higher cognitive functions we're talking about, like the impulse control and focus and self-regulation, are fairly complex. And I mean, if you don't believe me, look at what other animals in the animal kingdom, have our level of impulse control. So being able to, you snap in front of a dog or whatever, right? They can't really inhibit those reflexes and those impulses like we can. So a lot has to go right for those functions to happen appropriately in the prefrontal cortex. So when we're exercising and those cells have adequate blood flow, they have the neurotrophic factors to be able to connect with each other and the neurochemicals to be able to communicate. Your ability to actually have good impulse control, and in that moment, right, when faced with that decision making, you're more likely to be able to have a strong enough prefrontal cortex to make the more forward thinking decision.
So would it be accurate to say when you're doing physical fitness, you're increasing the blood flow to your muscles and you're growing, you're actually doing the same thing for your brain and your brain is growing?
Yeah, but almost more so. Even if it isn't physically growing, the health of those cells and the pathways, sort of think like telephone poles. Those telephone poles and fibers are getting stronger and more efficient and are then able to do their job in a better way. And you're more likely to be healthy and not have things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease as you age as well, which is a whole other conversation. But the same thing that's going to lead to those kinds of diseases is going to make your prefrontal cortex not as healthy as it should be and make it more difficult to recover from addiction or substance abuse disorder.
Okay, so you hit exercise and how that actually helps with impulse control. You also mentioned nutrition. Let's dive into that. What are some things that you've seen help with impulse control and actually bettering the brain and healing from just a nutrition standpoint?
So I think so many people in the diet and nutrition world focus on things to cut out, which can be stressful, right? Because we know that sugar is not good for us. We know that like MSG, for example, is what's called excitotoxic. So it's literally toxic for your cells, some of the ingredients in some of our foods. But healthy things that you can eat that are going to help your neurons to be more stable and kind of lead to all the things that we're talking about are things like essential fatty acids. So out in California, you guys have great avocados, right, fresh up from Mexico. So avocados are very healthy for the brain. The essential fatty acid profile in there are actually some antioxidants that are really healthy for your brain too. Fish is a really good one. So usually if people are eating fish once a week, they're getting enough of the essential fatty acids and don't necessarily need to take a fish oil. Everyone's different, so it depends. But one of the huge things that we're finding is as long as people are getting adequate levels of essential fatty acids and protein, they feel more satiated or more satisfied from their meals, and then they're less likely to reach for that bag of chips or drive to Taco Bell in the middle of the night, or those kinds of poor dietary decisions that we make when we're feeling that kind of ravenous level of hungry that we probably wouldn't make otherwise. So being able to kind of pick the right things and fill ourselves up on those, I've found is a better advice than be like, oh, avoid this, avoid that, avoid that, because that's just not healthy. It creates kind of like almost paranoia around food.
Yeah, and I've seen that quite a bit of reading lately of genetically altered food and how it's designed to actually not satiate us, so we want and desire more, and actually triggers the brain to continually go to these fast food and this high process.
Right. Right. Yep.
So what's interesting is I grew up being an athlete and was always doing different things, but never really looked at actual macronutrients and micronutrients. And about 6 months ago, made a complete overhaul of cutting out sugar, cutting out processed food. And what's incredible, and I didn't know this, and I'm assuming it's normal, I was constantly living under a state of inflammation, and I was always in pain and just felt tight with everything. And it took about 3 or 4 weeks, but it was like it reset and rebooted everything. And so I can actually taste food now that I couldn't taste before. The clarity, the brain fog is gone. I'm totally satiated by how I eat now with the macronutrients for me of what works for my body. I've been kind of experimenting with myself over the last 6 months, but I had no idea. I mean, you hear it and you're like, oh yeah, okay, I'll eat a little better, but no idea how much different food is. Because if you think about it, food literally the brain takes the most juice, if you will, aka energy, to run and to keep going. So when you're feeding it that crap gas, like think of a car, it continues to knock and just barely goes by. But when you give it high octane, it is like jet fuel of I can actually feel it. I'll eat and within a few minutes you start seeing that spike, but not the dopamine spike like with sugar and then a crash. It like goes up, but then there's like the satiation for an hour or two where you've got the spike of energy. I had no idea.
Right. Right. It's kind of like if you've got a campfire going and you want to stay warm, you don't want to put a bunch of little sticks on the fire because you're going to have to keep feeding it and keep feeding it, and the fire's going to go up and down and up and down. It's our body just wants that large solid log that's just going to give it that stable blood sugar that it needs. And I think that brings up a good point of our neurons don't have fallback energy source, right? So for example, if we were working out, we're like hitting some curls, you kind of feel the burn in your biceps, you get to the end where you can barely do it, your cells in your bicep, those muscle cells, are burning through different fuel sources. So there's the initial fuel source, then they have a fallback, and there's even another fallback from there. Whereas our neurons are only going to be able to produce energy from our blood sugar. So the muscle cell itself kind of has its own little store of food, whereas the neuron is only going to be as stable as our blood sugar is. So if our blood sugar is going up and down and up and down and up and down, then the neurons are only going to be able to function good and then bad and then good and then bad, as opposed to that sustained fuel source leads to them being able to do their jobs appropriately all the time. And I explain this to people like, have you ever been hangry before? Like you're on a car trip with someone and you didn't stop for food early enough. You start fighting, then you stop for food, you're eating a little bit, and you're like, hey, what were we arguing about earlier? So it just kind of shows how even just little changes in our blood sugar can go a long way in modulating our behavior, our impulse control, our attention, our decision making, our social skills. So taking care of your brain isn't something that you do once. It's kind of a lifestyle and it's a habit, like we talked about earlier. You're either undergoing the habit of addiction and you're living in your temporal lobe, or you're going through these more forward thinking brain healthy habits that are going to lead to just more life enjoyment and fulfillment, because your brain crafts your reality. The information coming into your brain and your experience of that is what your life is. So being able to modulate and kind of revel in that, as opposed to constantly just seeking comfort and trying to feel good because you're kind of on this up and down roller coaster. That's the prefrontal cortex way of living, as opposed to the temporal lobe way of living, the limbic system way of living.
So intriguing. So when we're in that middle part of our brain, that is where we're impulsive. We're just looking for those little sticks to consistently try to keep going, and it's kind of the more. And when we work out, when we eat healthy foods, that moves us back to the prefrontal cortex that operates more off of longevity and satiability and running consistently and sustainable. Am I hearing that right?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Fantastic. So we hit the exercise part, we hit the food part. Now you mentioned sleep. How important is that? Because I know most people that are in the early stages of recovery, sleep is very difficult.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're used to kind of something kind of helping you get into that sleep mode. And even medicated sleep isn't always a good thing, good path to go down, because you basically are substituting one drug for the next. But,
Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by Pacific Shores Recovery. We have been an industry leader for over 25 years in the mental health and addiction field. We have worked with thousands and thousands of individuals and their loved ones overcome addiction. If you or a loved one needs help or support of any kind, reach out at the number below. We have people standing by to help.
sleep is fairly complex, and to kind of pull the curtain back for people that aren't reading medical research all the time, and doctors, sleep is one of the least understood parts of human behavior and how the brain works. So for the longest time they saw that there's these changes in how CSF pressure is flowing in the brain. So the brain is kind of sitting in this fluid, and they found that that fluid actually helps to keep the brain clean and healthy. And when we sleep, there's these changes to how that's flowing. Well, a paper just came out recently kind of challenging all of that. Not that it kind of does away with all of that evidence, but sleep is very complicated. But what we do know for sure is that your sleep quality is just as, if not more important than sleep duration, right? So being able to fall asleep is important, but what's your quality of sleep like? And one of the biggest things that we tell patients is to minimize the amount of light that's entering your nervous system as soon as the sun goes down. Because for the longest time, as our brains evolved, the only thing that we had to know when it was time to be up and about during the day or when it was time to go to bed and sleep is the sun going up and then the sun going back down. So you have receptors in the sleep parts of your brain called the pineal gland that are only receptive to light. There's no other connections into the pineal gland except for those light receptors. So when you're watching TV and you're trying to fall asleep and the lights are off, the LED screen, that backlight from the TV, is activating your nervous system and telling it, hey, it's daytime right now. Hold off on those sleep chemicals. Hold off on those sleep chemicals. And you're sitting there like trying to fall asleep watching TV, bombarding your brain with light. So usually I recommend think mood lighting, like a restaurant or something. As the sun goes down, you want to have lights in your house that are more kind of dim, like little lamps and things like that. And actually, their incandescent bulbs are becoming more and more available because LEDs, they've found, even though they're great for the environment and nothing's perfect, LEDs, they've found activate our nervous system even more than these traditional incandescent bulbs do. So, and then there's the red lights that people look into as well. But modulating light, it's actually one of the best things that you can do. So then a lot of times what I hear is then, well, it's like, well, what, I'm so bored. Like, what do I do? Just like sit there in the dark, and that can be difficult. But usually I recommend audio because you can, have an audiobook playing on your phone or be listening to this podcast or something along those lines without a lot of light bombarding your nervous system. And you can even, with settings, you can usually turn the backlight down on a TV too, to even just start taking baby steps in that direction.
So we see a lot of clients that say, I fall asleep, like I have to sleep with the TV on. What do you say to a person to kind of phase out of that?
Yeah, that's usually audio is what we go to as well, but that's where too what you're eating and your exercise is going to play into are you sleeping appropriately, right? So if you are exercising and you're exercising adequately, it should really help with secreting the neurochemicals that'll help your brain get into the good phases of sleep. But usually what I recommend is just pivot to an audiobook or something so that you still get that sense of you're being entertained and you get some sort of, my dad always called it brain candy growing up. So it's one of those terms that just sticks with you, but so you're getting a little bit of brain candy, but you're not getting a lot of light in through your optic nerves in the eyes.
Okay, so you're talking about doing looking into finding more out about your brain because so many people that suffer from addiction, you're finding a direct correlation to some form of brain trauma. That we talked about the importance of exercise and working out. We talked about the importance of nutrition and making sure what you're feeding yourself because it's all combined. And then the importance of sleeping. Is there anything else, just kind of general level of what we're talking about that you would recommend a person do to really understand their brain and their impulse control better?
Talk to other people about it, is one of the hugest things. And, luckily, that's one of the things that, from my experience, I feel that the addiction world has right is that idea of getting people together and having them converse and communicate. Um, we saw a study that in 2023, Americans spent more time alone than they did in 2021, which was we were basically still going through the pandemic in 2021, which is somewhat alarming because there's studies that show being alone, your brain literally starts to what's called demyelinate. So myelin is part of your brain's kind of protective sheet coating over the neurons. It's part of how your brain works. And if the myelin starts to break down, that's basically your brain aging. So excessive amounts of time alone leads to advanced brain aging, which is going to break down the cells in the prefrontal cortex, and it's going to lead to all of the impulsive behaviors that we've talked about. So being around other people, especially people who are going through shared experiences, is one of those things that I know isn't new advice for a lot of your patients or a lot of the people that you work with, but it seriously can be one of the best things to just be with another person activates your brain differently than sitting quietly on your own. And even just from a chemical standpoint, the chemicals your brain secretes when we're with other people tends to be healthy in terms of fighting off depression, fighting off these kinds of self-regulation issues and substance abuse issues that we're talking about. So getting around others and socializing is one of those things that is, I think, breaking down in terms of people don't think of it as a basic need for health when it absolutely is just as important as drinking water and eating and sleeping, being around other people.
Yeah, and that's huge because we see so many people get lost doing this and thinking, oh, no, I'm connected to all these people. But the brain is actually recognizing that as you are alone and you don't have the same chemicals released in your brain. And you mentioned myelin. I've been kind of going down the rabbit hole of neuroplasticity and myelin and how they act together. And neuroplasticity is basically making new neural connections, retraining, rewiring your brain. And they're saying there's a lot of things that you can do that are actually very simple, such as learning new sports or learning new things to do. And so what we're finding is as we take clients together for community and engaging in fun outdoor activities, whether it's sports, doing races together, different things, that actually helps with the neuroplasticity. And then the more repetitions you practice, that is the insulation, the myelin that you're talking about. And so that's where communal games with practice continues to strengthen both things. And then this helps move from what I'm hearing you say from that mid level of just seek comfort and kind of I always think of Homer Simpson, kind of that with the white noise in the back. Takes us from that mid level of seeking comfort to the prefrontal part of feeling connected and engaged and longevity and quality of life and all these wonderful things that also tie in, kind of come in full circle to exercise, food, and sleep. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of those things where the brain is insanely complicated as you dissect it and try to learn all the pathways and even looking at the different technologies we use to help heal the brain and diagnose the brain. But at the end of the day, it's pretty simple, right? Information in, processing, and information out. That's all the brain does. What you eat's going to affect it. How you sleep's going to affect it. It's all the things that we know we should be doing, but we just sometimes need a little encouragement and help in making the right decision. Those are generally the things that we recommend people do to then avoid having to, come see me for an immersive brain rehabilitation program, because that's something that I love my job and what I do, but a lot of times people can avoid these kinds of more costly immersive programs if they're doing the things day to day that are taking care of themselves and feeding their health.
Beautiful. So for those that are able to do what you just shared and are able to avoid working with you, fantastic. But those that need that additional part, how can someone do some research and find out a little bit more about your place?
Sure. So we put a lot of content onto Instagram as a way to just kind of connect with people. And we also have a lot of information on our website just about a lot of the treatments that we offer and sort of how we operate. And we also offer complimentary 15-minute calls for people that are interested in working with us, just to make sure that we're a good fit for what you're looking for and you're a good fit for our office as well. So anyone that's interested can check out our website. Feel free to contact the front desk and we can get you set up with a 15-minute phone call just to check in and see if, whether it's with us or some other resources we can try to connect you with. Like I said, it takes a village and nobody knows everything. We feel really strong in what we do, but also feel it's important to connect others when we think someone else can help, in a more profound way.
Fantastic. So what's that website?
That would help probably, right? It's apexbraincenters.com. If you just look up Apex Brain Centers on Google, you'll find us. There's plenty of research on the blog, and there's YouTube videos and Instagram. So we've got stuff all over the internet.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on and dropping some knowledge. Appreciate it.
Oh, of course. I'm really glad that we were able to connect, and it's important work you guys are doing. So hopefully we'll be able to stay in touch and just kind of keep serving.
Yeah, ditto. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
If you found this helpful, be sure to subscribe and send this to someone that you know.